Hello, U.S. History students. Today we'll be doing Notes 1.2, Manifest Destiny. So once again, you can either do this on a notebook page or you can do this on a Google document. Either way is fine. You do need to have a title. So our title, 1.2, Unit 1, this is our second set of notes, Manifest Destiny. And your essential question, what led to the United States fighting in a civil war? So I'm going to go ahead and view this and put the closed captions on for everyone to have. All right, so we're starting here in 1829. We're looking at President Andrew Jackson, who served from 1829 to 1837. Now, back in the early 1800s, we did have different voting requirements. We still had a democracy, but as we started as a nation, only white men who owned land could vote. So we started to expand voting rights in the early 1800s by letting white men who did not own property to be able to vote. So you can see how that expanded the voting population through these states and these maps. So with that, we had an increased voter turnout. If you let more people vote, they will go out and vote. So we had increases in white male suffrage. And Andrew Jackson really benefited from that. He became known as the common man's candidate. So men who weren't rich, who didn't own property, who didn't own land, they were the ones who went out and supported Andrew Jackson. At that time, the population of the United States was beginning to move further and further west. Andrew Jackson was the president, and he created a new Native American policy. So this was the Cherokee Nation before Andrew Jackson became president. And he issued a new policy called Indian removal. So Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and this gave authorization for our military to go in and forcibly remove Native Americans from Georgia to their new relocated home of Oklahoma. Actually, this is a current event that's happening. The Supreme Court just a couple months ago decided much of the lands in Oklahoma have now been deemed Cherokee land, and they are now required to give that land back to the Cherokee. So that's pretty cool. So this shows the Indian removal. They removed Indians from all of these states and forced them to walk over to these new lands in Oklahoma. They removed them from these lands and gave them the territory of Oklahoma because that wasn't as lucrative land. They weren't able to grow as much. It wasn't as profitable to have people on that land. And this was known as the Trail of Tears. This lasted for about a year, from 1838 to 1839. Before their trip, they gathered around the Native Americans. They held them by gunpoint, forced them into prison camps, and then they required them to give up their lands and migrate over to present-day Oklahoma. Many of them were forced to walk more than 2,000 miles. They didn't have any cars back then, so some of them were able to gather belongings in wagons, but the majority of them had to walk. That's elderly, that's children, everyone had to walk. It was an estimated 4,000 people that died from hunger, the exposure, and disease during this death march. President Jackson was reelected in 1832. In the early 1800s in the United States were known as antebellum America in the South. So this is a glorified time frame. We have movies like Gone with the Wind that try to make it seem like things were going so great in the South during that time. But of course, we know that that is not the case. There was slavery going. There was people fighting against slavery, though, who did benefit from it in the South. These two women down the left corner, these are the Grimke sisters. So they were actually born into a slave-owning family. And they were abolitionists, so they were against slavery. They fought against slavery. They left their home in the South. They moved up north, and they spent their days fighting against slavery. But states in the South were fighting to keep slavery alive. And we continue to expand west across the United States. So this would become known as manifest destiny. So we believe that we had the divine right, the right of God, to spread over the whole continent of the United States, even though there were millions of people living on these lands. So this is a famous painting of this period, American Progress, 1872, us moving westward across the United States. But as you can see, while this may be an angel representing our moving west and progressing forward, over here in the left corner, you see who we're pushing out. We are pushing out the native population, who we are forcing off their lands, and who we are killing by the thousands. In order to get news and mail westward, we established the Pony Express. This only lasted for about a year and a half, but it was able to get mail across the United States in just 10 days. So this was eventually replaced by the telegraph line, but the Pony Express, young men were wanted to get on horses and ride westward, even to right here in Sacramento. As we moved west, we moved into this area of Texas. Texas actually was a part of Mexico, and Texas fought its independence in 1836 from Mexico. So they had a war, Texas against Mexico. Texas was not part of the United States at that point. Texas actually won this and was an independent nation from 1836 to 1845. The most famous of these was the Battle of the Alamo, with Texas fighting against Mexico. Davy Crockett became a famous figure out of this time. And they became the Republic of Texas. That was what their nation was known as. People continued westward in covered wagons. You probably remember learning about this in elementary school. Maybe you played a game called the Oregon Trail. This is how people moved westward into these new territories. But everything wasn't great for everyone. You might have heard of the Donner Party, who died up near up near Tahoe in the mountains. So the Donner Party was a big group, so about 83 members of this family went westward, but only 45 survived to get to California. So unfortunately, once they got up in those mountains with those covered wagons, there was no roads. They were trying to get through. They got stuck in the snow, and they were forced to participate in cannibalism. In case you don't know what cannibalism is, that means eating people. So about half of the party did survive. The majority of them were young people, people under 18. And in 1846, we began a war with Mexico. So the United States actually fought a war with Mexico for 2 years, the Mexican-American War. This war was over the territories in the southwest part of the United States. We offered Mexico we offered them money to be able to buy the New Mexico territory. We wanted California. We wanted all of that land, and Mexico obviously did not want to give up that land. So we fought a war about it. Once we won that war, we forced Mexico to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that gave us all of this territory that used to be part of Mexico. So my family is actually from New Mexico, this state that is now right here. And my grandpa always likes to say the border crossed us. We didn't cross the border, because the border would cross all of these places that used to be Mexico. The territory that we are on now used to be part of Mexico, but now it's part of the United States. So Mexico was forced to give up Texas, California, New Mexico, what would become Colorado, Nevada, Arizona. The U.S. gave Mexico $15 million and agreed to pay any of the claims against American citizens that were owed to Mexico, which were around $3 million. So all of this territory here is territory that we gained in the United States because of that war. And quickly after, gold was discovered in the California hills. So gold right here at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento brought a lot of people westward into California. In 1849, we had lots of people coming to California in what we call the Gold Rush. Once again, you probably learned about this a long time ago in elementary school, how people came over to mine for gold because they thought they would strike it rich here in California. These people came over in 1849, hence the name the 49ers. A famous football team in this area is named after them. So the United States begins to look a lot more like it is today in the 1850s. But we still have to decide what we're going to do about this national issue of slavery. So I'm going to briefly go over slavery. I know you learned about this in middle school, but I think it's important to give you context for our civil rights movements coming up later on in this year. So slavery lasted in the United States from August 20th of 1619. 1619 is when the first enslaved people were brought to the United States, and ended on June 19th, 1865. That is after the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and that's when the last enslaved people were notified. That day is a holiday known as Juneteenth, the end of slavery. So lots of times when we talk about slavery, people use outdated terminology, and I want to make sure that we're using updated 2020 terminology. Okay, so instead of calling people slaves, they were hostages or they were enslaved people. They weren't just slaves. People who were slave owners, now we would call them human traffickers. Okay, things like that. Plantations were death camps. There was no women that were mistresses to their human traffickers. They were rape victims. We need to make sure that we are honoring these people and what they went through. So, a previous example, slave families lived in plantations owned by white slave owners who hired overseers to maintain discipline. Now, Black families were held hostage in death camps by white human traffickers who employed torturers to torture and kill them. See the difference? So, as I said, in 1619, the first Africans were brought to Virginia in a town called Jamestown. They were brought here by the Dutch, and this was at the beginning of the genocide that we committed. So, some people might ask, why would we not enslave the native population that already lived here? Well, the native population was susceptible to European diseases. We saw that because we weaponized diseases against them. They had their own political allies. They knew the land, they knew the territory. They had fought in wars and lived here for a long time before Americans ever got here. Americans, quote unquote, ever got here. And Africans that we brought over had low escape possibilities because they were highly visible because of their skin color. But stories that aren't often told is that there were actually a lot of enslaved people who did escape, and then they went over and they made new lives with the Native American populations. So there's a book about this, in case any of you are interested. It's called Black Indians. So in the northern states, they began to get rid of slavery first. So they had the abolition of slavery. They ended the slave trade. They decided no more new slaves could be brought to the United States. But unfortunately, we knew that would not end slavery. The life of an enslaved person was very, very difficult. Most were not literate. They could not read or write. It was illegal for them to learn to read or write. And then they had what they called slave codes. So they could not carry a weapon, gather in groups, get married, defend themselves, speak in court. They faced harsh working conditions, and their punishments were barbaric. But they did fight back. That's one thing that I really need you to know, is that people who were enslaved did fight back. Some of them would run away. Some of them would be truant. Women would actually refuse to have children. They would refuse to reproduce because they did not want to bring children into the world that they were currently living in. And then some would do covert actions, sometimes smaller things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, like breaking tools or starting fires, killing the animals, destroying crops, things like that. There were 4 major revolts of enslaved people. We're going to read a document about Nat Turner and the slave rebellion that he helped to lead. So we're going to read about that later on. The punishments were brutal torture. It wasn't just physical, but also a lot of the torture was emotional as well. So they would separate families. And the United States was pretty much split between free and slave states. So as you can see, all the yellow states on this map here are slave states or slave territories. The ones on the top, the green ones, they are free states or territories. Okay. So there was an even divide between free states and slave states. So when California became a state, there was a throw off between the balance of free and slave states. There was more free states than slave states, and tensions began to grow between the North and the South because a lot of enslaved people were escaping from the South and they were heading up north in the Underground Railroad. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a famous author. She wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin at the time. This was an anti slavery novel that explained the life of someone who was enslaved. There was 2 million copies sold in a decade. You got to think for most people, they had never seen a plantation. They didn't know anything about slavery. They may have heard about slavery, but they hadn't actually physically seen it before. There was no iPhones, there was no video cameras, there was nothing like that where people could watch and see what was actually going on. So to read about it in a book brought a lot of people to the anti-slavery side. Abraham Lincoln said that she was the little lady who started the Civil War because people learned from her about the horrors of slavery. So they decided to have a compromise over the Kansas Territory to try to even the numbers between free states and slave states. There was the Dred Scott case in 1857. Dred Scott had been enslaved. He was born enslaved, and he decided that he was going to bring up a case up to the court system saying that actually, since he was born in the United States, that means he is a citizen, and slavery is against his rights as a citizen, against the Constitution. So he brought this to court. But unfortunately, the court made the decision that he could not sue in court because he was not a citizen, because enslaved people could not be citizens. So we had this new senator, Abraham Lincoln, from Illinois, and he decided he was going to run for the presidency. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And what I need you to know is there was also some white people who were fighting against slavery, not just the Grimke sisters, they were fighting against slavery, but John Brown was actually an abolitionist, and he was maybe, you might think of him as like a precursor to Malcolm X, who we're going to learn about later. So he decided that the only way to fight against slavery was through armed conflict. He thought that people needed to take up arms and defend themselves against this violence that was being brought upon them. So he actually organized a lot of people to fight back against slavery, and he ended up being hung for his crimes. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln does win the presidential election. A lot of people are very upset about this in the South because they think that Abraham Lincoln is going to take away slavery. So because of this, the first state in the Union decides to secede. So that means they are going to leave the United States. South Carolina on December 20th, 1860 decides they are no longer going to be a part of the United States. They would be the first of many who are going to follow this, and that is going to lead us to the Civil War, which we will talk about tomorrow. So don't forget to write a summary at the end of your notes, just a couple sentences wrapping up what you learned about today.